Hello, everybody. Welcome back to In the Seaweeds, episode number 7. I am delighted to be joined today by Emil Stefanutti, co-founder and CEO of Gaia Dynamics, one of the most exciting tech startups in supply chain today. Emil, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Graham, it's great to be here. I enjoy conversations with you, so I've been looking forward to this.
Well, this is a very special episode for me because to see successful founders from other industries come into this kind of sector is something that really, really excites me. And we'll get into, what you've done already. But for me, I think just for the audience listening, I think this is great to see that supply chain is finally attracting more and more world-class entrepreneurs into the space as it kind of grows in the age of AI. But I'd love to start from the very start, Emil. If you could take us back to your early days, what was growing up like? How did it kind of shape the entrepreneur that you became today?
Yeah, so I grew up in Latin America. I was born in Venezuela. My mom is Venezuelan, my dad is Italian. And so I'm a little bit of a hybrid, and I've been in the US for the last 20 plus years. So I grew up in a different country that it is today. You're probably seen it in the news recently, and it's a little crazier today than it used to be. But I grew up in a lower middle class, place in Caracas. So I'm not, on paper, I'm not the guy that you would imagine, right, being a tech CEO these days. But I had an entrepreneur father, and that's all you need sometimes, right, is those examples and those just being there when somebody else is going through it, and even when you don't realize, you're too young to realize what's actually happening. I do think that a lot of those things actually stuck to me, and I think I'm an entrepreneur. I think because I saw my dad being an entrepreneur, and in a way that seemed natural later on for me, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I guess I love the way it hurts.
Very, very well put. And what was your kind of, going from kind of your teenage years, school, to like your first journey? What was that like for you?
Yeah, so my first startup, and I didn't know it was a startup or a company. I was a 14-year-old kid, and I I was madly in love with this girl that was about 5 or 6 years older than me. So I had no chance, but hey, why not try anyway? And I saw her once. She was the sister of one of my best friends, and she came back, home, and I was there, and she was holding this like this bulletin board cork made thing that especially girls used to use a lot back in the day, before social media. And I said, well, where do you get that? How much you pay? And she said, no, I paid $35 for it. And I said, you know what? I think I can make those, right? I was pretty good at drawing and whatever. So the day after, right after school, I just, had whatever savings I had, which were probably $50 or so, and bought some materials and created some of these things. And, to my surprise, the morning after, before my first class in high school, I had sold all of them and I made a killing. So that was my first experience with entrepreneurship. I didn't know, right? I thought it was just fun, and it was a fun way to make money. Plus, I thought it would increase my chances of of being able to appeal to this way older than me girl. That didn't happen, but it became pretty successful. After a while, I sold several hundreds of these things, and it was a lot of interesting experiences. And one day, the whole thing ended because some guy showed up. I was outside of the school selling these things to people, and a guy shows up and says, "Do you have a permit for this?" I say, "What do you mean?" Right? I'm 14, right? Keep that in mind. and in Latin America. So I say, what do you mean a permit? Well, why do I need a permit? I'm just drawing things on these these cork boards and selling them to people I know from school. So, well, if you're selling these things, you need a permit or whatever. And that, believe it or not, Graham, became my first experience with regulation compliance, right? So that was my first frustration, right? And I didn't know it then, but I can totally trace, those connecting dots from that moment to what I do today. It was incredibly frustrating. It ended up killing my small business because I just couldn't figure out what they needed, how to get it done, and so on. And some of the regulations I just couldn't comply with. For instance, I was a minor. I needed to be an adult to do some of these things. So that's kind of how my real journey in the entrepreneurship actually started. And then, of course, I went to school in Italy. Um, I went to design school, and that's kind of still the way I think about a lot of these things. I kind of design my way around things to this day. And I always had this thing, right, where I wanted to build stuff. And so from there, after I graduated from college in Milan, I started, my own design firm. So I was kind of shifting to a different type of entrepreneurship. And from there, dot com, then the dot com boom became a big thing, and there were so many opportunities, and it was too attractive for somebody like me, right? And so that's how the whole thing got started. This is by now, Gaia is my fifth company. I had, two exits before, and and I lied to my wife already a couple of times saying this is the last one after the exit, and yeah, I don't think she believes in me anymore when I say those things.
Wow. And what's it like, when you look at those exits, what's especially incredible is that, they've been across different sectors. Um, do when you think about products, and I know the way you think about the design and how they're put together and how they're made and how to differentiate, I know you think about that deeply. Was that kind of where, things like media to legal tech, is that kind of what drew you to those areas or?
Well, the way I see it, right? I think again, it's a very much a designer's mindset, and it's funny. I'm old enough to have been a designer before design thinking was a thing, and actually, to me, that was just thinking. So it was good when somebody said, there is such a thing as design thinking, and that officialize my weird way of thinking. So now I had a term that I could use, and it was cool. But I think the way I see it, right, all these companies to me had in common a problem, right? That there was a problem that needed to be solved, and I had this conviction that it could be solved with good technology. So in a way, I don't see them as so different, right? So of course, there is the actual variables and the actual nuances of the each market are different, but the way you approach them and the way you think about product and the way you raise money and the way you hire people and all those things, I don't think they change all that much. I mean, so I see where you're, and I can tell how people say, well, you were in legal tech and you were in media, and now you're in supply chain and trade tech. You're moving across industries. The way I see it, the problem solving and the design thinking aspects of it are about the same. It's just a different kind of problem in a different industry, but the problem solving part of it is very similar across the board.
Yeah. And when you after your exits in media and legal tech, what was the kind of moment for supply chain software, cross-border compliance? Was there kind of an aha moment? Was there an event that you were like, okay, this is the next one?
Yeah, and I had been thinking about this for a while, right? So legal tech, of course, has a lot of similarities with, there's a lot of compliance pieces, and how you sell to your ICP in legal tech and in compliance is also very similar. So a lot of similarities there. And again, I remember when I was about 16, 17 years old, my dad, who was in pharma, we lived in Italy. He had, a company that produced, raw, pharmaceutical, kind of bulk ingredients, and and he was starting to sell to the U.S., right? And FDA became a trending topic at our dinner table. It was, a nightmare for him to figure out how to navigate the whole compliance piece. So again, I think I had been thinking about that for more for longer than I even realized. Right? It's been, I wish I had Gaia, yeah, at that moment available to my dad. Right? And in a way, it's a full circle now where I'm actually building these for, I guess, other people's dads that have the same or similar problems. So now fast forward a few years, I had, exited Contract Room, which was in the legal tech space. And I started collaborating with Andrew Ng's AI Fund as an advisor. And if you don't know AI Fund or what they do, they're a venture lab that is fully focused on AI, solving big problems with AI. And so, we started having a conversation. What else, right? What are the additional other problems that could be solved? And I think very quickly, cross-border regulation compliance became, a thing. Little did we know, right? This is mid 2024. So, President Trump didn't get into office until later, all right, and he hadn't won the election, so the whole rhetoric around tariffs wasn't even there, but it still made sense, right? And I had seen the pain in my own family before, so it was a huge problem before Trump became president. It just became more front and center and in the news since then. So that was really the journey. We were talking about what else, and with experience with, compliance and legal and AI and all of that, it just made sense. It just felt like the market was there. The problem was huge. It was very intriguing. And then obviously, I'm the kind of guy that when somebody like Andrew Ng says, "Do you want to start a company together?" I'm not the guy that says no almost ever.
Your hand was up before he finished a sentence. You were in.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
of
I
course.
mean, we've gone maybe 15 minutes without saying the word AI, which is, I think, a record for the show. Um, I can't think of many people in my circle, Emil, that every single time I meet, I learn something about AI. When we had the breakfast together in Las Vegas, you put me onto another tool to look at output on engineering, and it's been transformative for what we do. You really, really do. You're far ahead of almost everybody I know in terms of thinking about AI. Is it, when you look at Gaia now and the journey you're on, and the pace of change with tariffs and war, and the way the world moves and changes so rapidly in real time, even from that moment of inception with Andrew to today, is it relatively different in terms of, like, are we kind of past the point you thought we'd be in AI already, or how do you think about that, and how you use it now in development?
No, I think, I'm an optimist in general. So I think we're actually only getting started. I mean, I think we're just warming up. Every day there's like, oh man, there's this new thing, right? Or there's a couple new things that will help us not only do the things that we thought we were going to be doing, but also, invent more things that we couldn't, think of before, right? So um, I think that we are scratching the surface still, in my opinion. I can see how my team is performing now progressively better, faster, more efficiently. I think our, you know, um, I'm realizing that the art of the possible just keeps expanding, which is for somebody like you and me, it's super exciting. I think it's stimulating. I'm trying to figure out what else can we be doing for our customers, right? And I think the tariff situation, right? It's made it even more urgent, right? I think that the more I talk to our customers, particularly big importers, manufacturers around the world, they're starting to see tariffs almost the way, they were seeing, currency exchange rates or interest rates fluctuation or, even weather patterns and stuff, right? They know for a fact that these are things that are just going to change. It's not the way it used to be where tariffs was, well, tariffs are there. Sometimes they change, but not that much or not that radically and definitely not that fast, right? And now I think there's more of a mindset that we have to start thinking about is just kind of the same way we think about interest rates, right? They're going to be changing, and are we going to be ready when that happens to navigate whatever changes come our way and protect our margins, protect our EBITDA, protect our viability as a business, right? So this affects small companies, big companies, almost everywhere in the world, as far as our experience so far has told us.
Yeah. When you think about, the supply chain sector, Emil, it strikes me that with what you do, you're taking in huge data sets, a huge amount of data. Do you think that kind of like AI is particularly relevant because you have to take in so much data and you have to be able to transform it and in some cases manipulate it, add to it? Does AI make a pretty big difference?
Of course, it does. It's a combination where we see the biggest impact, right? It's definitely crunching a lot of the rule data, right? So there are um, so many rules, and that's what drives a lot of the trade and customs world is rules, right? And what changes a lot are rules, right? So even even before Trump became president, there had been 7,000 changes to global trade regulations in the previous 5 years, right? So that's over 120 changes a month, right? So keeping track of what those changes are and what impact they would have in different industries or different products with different classifications and all of that is really where AI can do an amazing job, right? Is just not only tracking the data, but also figuring out the connections between that specific change that just happened and then all of the ramifications of what the impact is going to be, let alone now, kind of what are the options or alternatives that I have as a company to navigate those changes, right? So I think it's been evolving from let me kind of tell you what you need to know as a customer, right? And that's step one. So if you're and most conversations in our space start with, if I have a product made of these specific materials, components, or ingredients in this country of origin, and I'm moving it to this country of destination, question one is, what do I need to know? And seems like an easy question, but it's not, especially if you are distributing things or importing things from different places. Like, we have customers doing business in 100 plus countries, right? So what do you need to know when you're importing goods from different countries, and what do you need to know when you are exporting goods into those countries becomes complex, right? So what are your classifications, your tariffs, what regulations are applicable to that product and in that country? Are there any restrictions? Is this even something that we can import into that country, and so on? And then you move, and progressively we moved into, okay, now that we know what we need to know, is what do we need to do, right? So what are the actions that we actually need to take to be compliant, right, when we move those goods into those places, right? And sort of, it's essentially, the first one is like sort of keeping me out of jail, to keeping me, out of trouble, and getting and then keeping me out of delays and so on. And I think what we're seeing now is the next big question, which is what can I optimize, right? What can I change? How do I protect, our margins and our bottom line when these, fluctuations take place? So AI is incredibly critical now for all of these pieces, mainly because the amount of data, as you said, but not just what are the tariff rates, but also what are the rules, right? That are applicable in those countries for those products, and how do those change? That's really the biggest thing that AI is being contributing to.
Yeah. And when you think about that, I mean, you are operating at the intersection of software, customs, regulation, and actually real money. Um, what do you think the hardest part is? Is it the tech, the data, the customer behavior, or the compliance risk?
Um, well, nowadays, I think the biggest issue, I think, is its volume, and I think it's four things in my opinion. But number one is volume, right? So especially in the US, where we went from roughly 56 million cargo shipments going in and out of the country in any given year to about 1.4 billion packages that get scrutinized, by customs now. So that's a 26x, increase in volume, right? And that's mainly because of the de minimis provision being terminated. So essentially, that means that now you have 26 times the number of packages and things that you need to be tracking, or you need to be getting ready for that kind of scrutiny. So volume has been massively problematic. Imagine this is like you driving in your highway, going back, going to work on a daily basis, and all of a sudden there are 26 times the number of cars in there. And by the way, they just threw in, a couple of toll booths just to make it even more interesting for you, right? So it's a bottleneck, and it's very heavy. And then the combination of that with the increase in complexity. So a lot of the tariff changes that we've seen recently are not just, used to be 10% and now it's going to be 20. Some of these changes are even on how you structurally calculate these things, right? So now we're saying, well, it's not just going to be that you pay 10% over things that are made of steel. It's that now you have to describe what percentage of the product is actually made of steel, and you pay one rate for those with that percentage, and a different rate for everything else in that product, right? So that makes it super complicated. The third thing that I think makes it super hard is that the population of qualified people to do this is not keeping up, right? So you have becoming a customs broker, especially in the US, a licensed broker. It's hard. You have to pass an exam that is famous, for being one of the toughest ones to pass. So just to give you an idea, in October, the passing rate for humans was 12%. So only 12% of the people taking the exam can become licensed brokers, right? We're happy to see our AI hit 100%, but that's a topic for another day. So that's a huge problem, right? And we see in a lot of the conversations with brokers out there, one of the biggest concerns is retention of these people, right? They're starting to get to a point where pressure is big. They're responsible for a lot of things, and they're saying life is too short. There's is too much pressure, and there are too many changes, and so that the combination of those three things, it's make things very chaotic. And then the fourth, of course, is that all of this is being done manually, or was being done manually up until companies like ours showed up. So you put all of that together is a recipe for a huge bottleneck, and that's kind of what we're seeing in the industry these days. So I think, is it financial? Is it tech? Is it, the regulatory piece? I think is a little bit of everything. But those four are the biggest sources of issues that we see right now.
Super interesting. Thank you. And shifting gears for a second, one thing I always kind of feel like as you get older and you kind of have experience to kind of give back to younger folks, and I probably do, like, a couple of calls a month with young founders in supply chain that have different questions, and one that's come up a lot recently, and I'd love to get your take on it is, supply chain is famously slow moving. Compared to other industries, and even things like the Series A bar used to be $1 million for a decade probably or something, and now all of a sudden it's 2 or 3 million, and maybe it's two yesterday and three tomorrow. And there's all these stories of people going from 0 to 10 million ARR, but some people don't count ARR. And the premise behind it is, oh, someone's doing it in legal tech or someone's doing it somewhere else. And when you think about growing Gaia, I mean, you're already expanding to dozens of markets. You're moving at the speed of light. How do you kind of square that circle with, I want to grow, AI is going to allow software companies to grow much faster, but you're also selling a very complex product into a slow moving industry. How do you think about something like that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the rules, and I can even trace that those differences, right, in the different startups that I was a part of before, right? So yes, the way things get done and all those variables have accelerated. Um, I actually think that the supply chain industry is actually starting to move a little less slowly than it used to, right? And they're being forced to. There's a lot of pressure to move faster right now. It's not just about efficiency and all of that. I mean, I think for many companies that we're working with, it had become more of a survival thing, right? Like if you all of a sudden, and now it's quieted down a little bit, but there were people a few months ago that were seeing, well, now your tariffs just went from 25% to 145%, right? So that's life threatening. That's not just something where you can take your time and figure out. This is like, we may not even be around if we take too long. So I think that has changed a little bit. Obviously, the execution of some of these changes, like it's not easy. It's not something that you do very quickly. You say, I'm going to shift my manufacturing from China to Vietnam or to Mexico or to whatever. So I think it's not as slow as I remember it being before, or I thought it was going to be. It's actually moving a lot faster these days, at least for the things that we do, right? I'm sure that there might be other areas of supply chain where they have the luxury to move slowly, but not in our world, right? In our world, you move slowly, and chances are you do it at your own peril. So overall, I think we're moving fast because the actual market is asking us to move faster, right? So in a way, if you think about it, their speed is sort of dictating our speed a little bit. Like we're launching a bunch of different countries because we're getting bigger clients that are multinationals and say, I love what you're doing for us in the US and Canada, but can you do it for us in Australia and in Europe and in UK and now in India and so on? So we got to be there for them, right? So I think overall, in a way, ironically, their speed is actually making or forcing us to be faster and more efficient in what we do.
Yeah, such a great point. Um, I have a LinkedIn newsletter called Freight Tech AI 2030. I started it a few years ago, and it was on the basis that we would be at AGI in 2030. And now I think maybe we'll be at ASI in 2030, or I don't know,
Yeah.
spaceships will be flying around, who knows. But when you kind of look ahead, it's only 3.5 years, but it probably feels more given the pace of everything. Where do you see Gaia, and where do you see the wider like world, like in terms of building software? Is it going to be just like you prompt an AI and it just builds it and you go to bed? Like what are your aspirations on a company level, and where do you see the world, particularly the software building world, in 2030?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I, you know, I still think that great products have requirements, right? That you need to meet, no matter how you execute on them, right? So I think AI is amazing for people like you and me that have a bunch of ideas and that have, the needs for speed, right, when it comes to execution. because it allows us to do so much more, so much faster with so much less actually to start with, right? So we need less funding, less people, and in order to accomplish great things. But so I think, obviously there will be, in my opinion, a huge increase in volume of companies and startups building all sorts of things, right? Because it's easier, because it's faster. Again, I think this time is bigger than ever, but we've had situations before, right, where new technology advancements and whatever, made it easier, right? Even just AWS being, before and after AWS, all of a sudden you can build a bunch of stuff because you don't need to have your own servers and whatever. So you don't need to raise as much money. Ultimately, I think you need great products, right? Out of everything that you're seeing out there, there's some fast companies that are doing interesting stuff, but then you can tell very quickly which are the solid companies that are doing amazing, game-changing things, right? And I don't know if that's going to change. I doubt it, because ultimately AI is not just going to come up and build the great company for you. There's so much more that happens outside of just building, writing code. You still have to figure out what the vision is, what is the how are you going to execute these things, and a lot of those things are still hard to do, no matter how much AI you throw at it, right? Like, how do you convince great people to come work for you? How do you convince great investors to invest in your company? How do you convince great customers to trust your product and trust that you're going to be there for them and solve their problems in a big way? I think loyalty, of course, from those customers, I think that will change quite a bit, right? So now, the ability for them to jump from one product to another that is slightly better or even a lot better, I think it's a huge motivation for, I'm sure, people like you and me to say, well, we have to stay really, really aware of, are we really making them happy, and are we making them happy consistently and in the long run, so that we don't get, replaced so quickly by somebody who can actually, do the job better than we can, right? So I think that is a huge point of pressure, right, for a founder and CEO in our shoes. Is, now the better looking, the faster, growing, or the best, better solution could be out there, really getting ready to eat your lunch. So that, I think, is the biggest change that I see in my own day-to-day world. It's like, okay, we need to be way better than we needed to be before in order to retain those customers, make them happy, and keep growing.
Absolutely. And I also think as well, Emil, that there's a big difference between, being in a business saying, I want to build a tool that will give me visibility of dashboards across different systems, and I can now maybe do that in Claude Cowork myself. Big difference between that and saying, we're going to vibe code our 50 country Salesforce CRM that's been around for 15 years. And meanwhile, Salesforce are putting out new software every week that's going to be best in class, and they're going to maintain it and secure it. And, I think that's another big element of it as well, is like, if you look at, trying to replicate something like you do, it's close to impossible, just the level of difficulty. If you want to build a tracker and show where ships are, maybe a little bit easier. But I think the differentiation between vibe coding simple tools versus like critical systems is a big part of it too.
Absolutely. Specialization is tough, right? And we see it right now. I mentioned we took the license broker exam. We hit 100%. We took the same exam using Gemini, ChatGPT, Claude, and their results were way better than humans, but they wouldn't have passed the test. So, specialization still matters, I think. If you get really good at the one thing that your customers are asking you to solve, that's still not easy to do, and not something that you can just do overnight.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Um, my last question, Emil, it's one of the favorites of our listeners, and it's one I really like. Actually, quick funny story. It goes back to our first episode with Patrick Berglund, the CEO and founder of Zanetta. Um, And I went to see him in Norway last year, and I was going to his office, and I got this map from the team about, how to get in and where to go. And I kind of presumed that I would be like ushered into a room in the building, and he would be waiting, and there'd be people around him. And I got to the floor where Zanetta have in Oslo, which is an amazing building, and I see the elevator doors open, and it was a windy, wet day in Oslo, and I see this guy coming out with a dog and a poncho, and he's wet, and the dog is shaking mud all over him. And he turns around, and it's Patrick. And I'm like, he's such a grounded guy. And I think all the great CEOs like you and Patrick and all the other great ones have one particular thing in common, which is kind of humility and being very down to earth. But the last question I always ask is, because it does fascinate people about, like, how does someone like you allocate your time? What does a typical day look like for you?
Wow, it's a great question. And these days, I have to start by mentioning I have a 6 month old baby, so that is a little bit of a bias, right? So you start a lot of your mornings, with some sort of diapering or bottle situation, right? But in general, I try to stay really organized. The number of things, as you know, popping up on a daily basis is can get overwhelming. For the most part, I divide my week into more specific missions on a daily basis, meaning that I have Mondays where I do more corporate stuff. So I try to make sure that Monday I'm taking the meetings that I need, to talk about things that matter from the corporate perspective. So lawyers and accounting and finance and things like that. Tuesdays is product, right? So I try to block as many things that I need to, get myself into deeply, right? To product stuff. And I try to do it in a day. What I found is that helps me stay more focused and be able to think for a longer stretch of time about one thing in a more kind of deep way. It's not always easy, but it works for me. And then you have the marketing and sales day, and then you have more like the vision, date, and that really helps me kind of compartmentalize a little bit. I don't have a lot of time to waste, right? So I mean, I have a family, and I have work, and I have hopefully some time to read, and to work out and to do things that will keep me sharp. Believe it or not, I stopped reading a ton of business books a few years ago. I realized I was just only reading, business books, and I found that I get a ton more motivation sometimes when I read a novel, like great literature, or even a biography. So now I rotate, and I try to find time to read and rotate between Latin American literature and European literature, and then biography here and there, and then some random thing, every now and then that would just keep me motivated and keep me inspired. And yes, the eventual business book here and there, of course. But so I try to find the time to be with my family first. I think after doing this a few times and having a few startups, you learn that what are the things that you gave up or that you sacrifice a lot of that you probably would want to do differently this time around. So being a repeat founder helps in that way, that you know a little better what are the things that can actually kill your business or kill your family or kill yourself. So I try to balance those things out a little bit, not always successfully. I mean, this is a grind, but for the most part, I try to compartmentalize those things as best as I can.
That's an awesome schedule. I think I'll steal some of those from you on the organization piece. Not my strongest suit. Emil, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for taking the time. You're the founder of one of the most interesting companies in the space. Me and a lot of other people are following and cheering you on. So congrats on all the success. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Graham. It's always a pleasure. And thanks for the kind words. I'm just working hard and trying to figure out what makes sense. So it's nice to hear. But when you're just typing your emails and you're coding and whatever, you're just a guy trying to make a dream come true.